Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Thompson, and today I'm delighted to bring you, on behalf of ACES High Gallery, a fascinating conversation with the distinguished aviation historian, broadcaster, and now author, Dr. Victoria Taylor, ahead of our exciting upcoming event, Eagle Days, on 1st of June, and in promotion of her debut book of the same name. Known for her extensive research and engaging storytelling, has captivated audiences worldwide with her work on aviation history, as showcased on her website, spitfirephillyaviation.com. Eagle Days, Life and Death for the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, blends a diverse range of sources together with official combat records and contemporary German newspapers. Her research and knowledge not only sheds light on the historical significance of World War II aviation, but also serves to highlight its influence on the artwork that portrays it. So be sure to join us as we delve into some of these areas and give you a taste of what to expect on Sunday, 1st of June. Victoria, thank you so much for joining us on the ACES High podcast. Wonderful to see you. How are you on this lovely day?
I'm doing really well, thank you, Chris. And thank you so much for inviting me onto the podcast, because even though it's going to be very exciting that we're doing certain events there later in the year, it's so lovely
Yes.
to be able to engage in so many other forms as well, and to bring it to social media and bringing it online as well, so that we can engage with as many people as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. So, Eagle Days, your debut book is launching soon.
Yes.
When exactly is
Yeah.
that launching? When can people get their hands on that?
It is the 22nd of May in Europe and in Britain. It's a little bit later into July, I'm afraid, for America and the rest of the world. But there is also, on the 22nd of May, there is the ebook and the audiobook as well. So there's plenty of options for people, because some want the traditional heavy tome and some want to be on the move. So we've tried to cater to all audiences on that score.
Did you narrate the audiobook?
No, it's narrated by the lovely John Sackville. So he's an
Oh, yes.
excellent actor. Yes, you'll have heard of him. He has done a lot of James Holland books,
Yeah.
and he's a real heavyweight in historical narration. So I was really thrilled to get him, because he also did the book for Len Deighton's Fighter, which of course is a classic
Yes.
in the
Okay.
genre. So yes, he I had quite a few people say, "Are you going to narrate it?" But I think he can bring a sort of gravitas to it that I can't quite do.
Okay, so very exciting. But I think I want to start with is you, actually. So, where did this all come from? Where did your love of history, and in particular aviation history, stem from, please?
My love in aviation history came from growing up in Lincolnshire. So I was born in Lincoln, obviously not too far from RAF Scampton. And it's one of those elements that if you grow up as a yellow belly, as we call ourselves in Lincolnshire, you can't escape the aviation heritage. It's very much in the in the waters, in the bloodline. And I was very fortunate to grow up just outside RAF Waddington. So no RAF family, actually. It was all Royal Navy
Right.
on both of my
Okay.
grandfather's sides. So I'm a bit of a traitor. But it was one of those moments, that I saw the red arrows flying, and then got really enraptured seeing the Battle of Britain Memorial flight each year at the International Waddington Air Show. And I think it was just seeing these really throaty, hearty aircraft, these amazing warbirds, the Lancaster, Spitfires,
Mm.
Hurricanes, etc. They brought a tangibility to history that I hadn't quite seen before. You sort of see ancient ruins as a kid and things like that, and you think it's really fascinating. But it always felt so separate and distinct
Distant.
from where we are now. Distant is
Yeah,
the
it's a
word.
bit
Absolutely.
distant, isn't
Yeah,
it? Yes. I remember seeing
it
the
is.
ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, and there's
Yeah.
not a huge amount of them left, really. So it's quite
No,
you have
no.
to really use your imagination. Whereas, as you said, with the planes, the bombers, it's there, they're roaring, they're
Yes.
throaty, and they're cruising over, and like, wow.
Yeah, absolutely. And they just, it's funny, because it all depends on what appeals to us viscerally, and that's always been the case for me. I've always found, I think that maritime elements and shipping are fascinating in their own way. I think tanks are amazing to watch, but there's just something about aircraft, and people always say about how, oh, it's a little boy's dream seeing an aircraft roll past, and I'm like, it's a little girl's dream as well.
Oh,
It's
wow.
one of those things that it just goosebumps, utter
Yeah.
goosebumps.
Well, the pilots were the heroes, weren't they? They were treated as the real
Yeah.
heroes during the Battle of Britain. And let's set the scene. So, Second World War commences because Hitler invades Poland, and that sets a
Mm.
chain, a motion of events. And you kind of have the phony war for a little while. They attack north, drags the Allied forces north, and it's like
Mm.
the reversal of the Schieffelin plan. And bang, lightning war
Mm.
kicks in, and
Yeah.
through they go. They go through France like a hot knife through butter, surround the
Mm.
BEF, and go on, tell me more from there. What leads from there, surrounding the BEF to the Battle of Britain, please set the
Of
scene.
course. Oh, goodness. Well, it's just an amazingly tense time. It's one of those moments where Germany seems unstoppable. They've cultivated this myth of invincibility, which has stretched all the way from the Spanish Civil War, and is seen in the destruction of cities like Guernica, where you have this terrifying biblical destruction that has come to the front line, to the home front. And it's one of those elements where it seems as if the Blitzkrieg or the Lightning War is just engulfing nation after nation. And Germany, of course, very much benefits from having land borders with so many different countries. So with
Yes.
Poland, there's an incredibly spirited defense that's made by the Polish Air Force, but ultimately it's not big enough and it's not modern enough to be able to contend with the Germans. And it's one of those moments where it's I can understand the idea of being utterly seized by paralysis in those interwar years, because when you think how horrific the First World War was and the fear of being stuck in another deadlock, I can understand why the policy of appeasement came through. But the Germans forced that hand. They go into Poland, they go into Norway and Denmark in Operation Weserübung in the spring of 1940. They are roaring through France and the Low Countries, and it's one of those elements that even though the Germans have still getting this kind of strain of going through all of these different campaigns, it's still gathering a momentum that is utterly terrifying. And for the British, when the British Expeditionary Force is sort of forced away from France, when we get Operation Dynamo in Dunkirk,
Hmm?
it's one of those moments where it's just hard to fully describe how much the fate of Europe was hanging on a knife's edge at
Yeah.
that time. That element of this is an unstoppable force, and as I cover somewhat in my upcoming book, it's one of those moments that even the neutral press, even in Switzerland, for instance, are saying surely an invasion of Britain is going to happen. Now, the Germans don't want to invade Britain if they can help it. Their original intentions were, of course, to extend their Lebensraum, or living space, in the east. That's why they moved Poland way.
Yeah.
And they don't want to get into it with Britain and France at the beginning of the war. It's sort of one of those things where Hitler has gambled and bluffed, and wasn't really expecting to be called on that bluff. So as we get to the summer of 1940, it's a moment where the Germans have to consider their options. They haven't quite finished off the British, as we see with the miracle of Dunkirk. And indeed, there's
Yes.
a lot of frustration in the Luftwaffe at the fact that the halt order comes through from Hitler. And there is a lot of, Adolf Galland, for instance, who's one of the most famous Luftwaffe aces, he talks about how it was not a complete victory because the Luftwaffe felt that they'd got the British and, of course, the Allied soldiers that were also retreating,
Surrounded.
uh,
Yeah.
surrounded, which they did. They'd got them trapped in a pocket on the coast of France, and in a very dire situation, being bombarded all the time. There's elements in May, I think it's the 14th of May, 1940, where the Germans refer to it as Fighter Pilots Day, and it's this element where they end up succeeding in shooting down so many British aircraft that they really feel supremely confident. And so it's one of those things that they feel the jubilation of the German success on the continent, but they're also frustrated because they know that the British have slipped through the cracks.
They could have
And
gone further, basically, is what you're saying. They
they
could have
could
got
have
us.
gone further.
They could
They
have
could
got
have done.
us. Yeah.
Yes, well, I think the RAF, for the longest time or during Dynamo had a lot of a bad rap in terms of the soldiers on the ground weren't seeing the fact that they were stopping so many German aircraft coming through. They just saw the ones that had made it through and were tearing up the beaches. And it's one of those moments where for the British, it's a success, it's a miracle in a way in terms of the fact they've managed to retreat their forces successfully, but it's also one of those things that it's a sign to the Germans that this isn't done, and it's a very uncomfortable truth. It's sort of that element of dread in the back of your mind, and you don't really want to completely and utterly, confront it. The idea that the British have not yet been fully defeated. But it's one of those things that at the same time, they're hoping that surely, logically, this is enough. You'd think that, okay, we've taken Poland, we've taken much of
We can do
Scandinavia,
it. Yeah.
we've taken France and the Low Countries. Therefore, it is a moment where you think, surely that is enough. Surely the British will not want to risk this. And I mean, General de Flieger Paul Deichmann, for instance, says that he was very surprised, or rather, the Luftwaffe was very surprised to still be ordered to prepare for the English campaign because they all thought the war was over. So, that's where we are heading into the summer of 1940. It is a great success for the Germans, but at the same time, there's already little niggling doubts about how this campaign is going to unfold with Britain and how to approach it optimally.
So that's interesting. So that doubt has emerged because both sides, obviously, you said there's been some conflict in Europe, but in terms of an aviation perspective, and Britain has
Mm,
had some success in terms of keeping quite a lot back in terms of Luftwaffe
mm,
advancement. Right. So
mm.
both sides had sized each other up considerably
Yes,
before the Battle of Britain. That's the key point. And tell
yes,
me, actually, you were mentioning there sort of the sense of dread of the Germans coming through. Did you watch
yes.
Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk?
I did. Yes, I
Did you
did.
get
Yeah.
that sense, that feeling in that film of that? I did personally because I felt the ticking of the clock and how time was against them. But I was just curious as to what your opinion was of that.
Yes.
If
I
you
mean,
think back.
there's some yes, there's some elements of that film that, we poke a bit of fun at, like Tom Hardy's,
Oh yes.
limitless ammunition and and a few things like that. But at the same time, I mean, I got the impression that the sort of the ticking time bomb kind of thing in the film does feel more from the Allied side.
Yes.
The kind of scrambling to be evacuated and being against the clock in that regard. But I think it does. I seem to remember. I think its soundtrack won an. I want to say it won an Oscar. It won some big award, and you can tell why. I think Hans Zimmer did the score actually, and it's
Yes.
one of those things that it really does bring home that intensity and that sense of can we slip through the cracks. And I think it's one of those moments that obviously for the Germans this was a very easy thing to spin propaganda wise because it looks like a clear retreat and
They've run
so
away.
many
Yes.
they've run away. They
They've run
couldn't handle
away
it.
over this
No.
over the channel. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's one of those things that, for the German propaganda newsreels, it's a dream. They are filming all of the equipment that's abandoned by the BEF in
Right.
France.
That's an interesting point. So Goebbels is rubbing
Exactly.
his hands. Goebbels is rubbing his hands, thinking, "Yes, I can
Yes,
spin. There's no need to
exactly.
spin this. It spins itself."
Well, it does. I mean, when you see Hitler wandering around by the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe and places like that, it is the very clear visual representation of that German domination. And as a result, I think it was perhaps easy for the Germans to sort of feel as if it were won and sort of have a sense of complacency. And by the end of the campaign in France, there's even some Luftwaffe personnel who are coming back from leave, and they can see at home in Germany that some of the factories are being converted back into peacetime articles. So, in certain parts of Germany, there is
Interesting.
the sense that, right,
Job
that's
done.
it. Surely it's done. That's it. The British haven't got any cards left to play. So obviously, it comes with a lot of fear, trepidation, etc. When Churchill has been, newly installed in May 1940. By June, is stating that the battle for France is over. I expect that the battle of Britain is about to begin, and as a result, it really does put a spanner in what they're expecting to be a lovely holiday, and enjoying their new occupation of France and all the flowing drinks and the lovely, charcuterie boards and everything.
Right. Yes. Yeah. A few pan au chocolats in there mixed with other things.
Yes. Yeah, and
Right.
it's not going to be that.
But so Churchill obviously has a big image on all of this, a thumbprint on all of this, if you like.
Yeah.
So, did the Luftwaffe suddenly have a different feeling about Britain and the potential for a war with Britain with the rise of Churchill?
Mm. The interesting thing is that I feel unofficially the Germans always considered Churchill to be the prime minister, even when he wasn't,
Right.
because Churchill appears so much in Nazi propaganda, even before that happens in May 1940. And it's interesting because when you look at some of the German propaganda that's on the early reconnaissance flights that are made by the Luftwaffe during the Phoney War. So, from post Poland up to the Scandinavian campaign and into the Scandinavian campaign, they often talk about Churchill and teaching Churchill a lesson. And I don't know how much of that is the visibility of Churchill in terms of he is a caricature's dream, he is
He
so
is. Yes.
recognizable. And Chamberlain features quite a lot in Nazi propaganda early on, but it's very limited. It's sort of him and his umbrella and just looking sad all the time with a very bushy mustache. Like that
Yeah.
is pretty much Chamberlain. Whereas I find it fascinating. I think the thing is with Churchill, because he's so vocal and because they see him as a danger to be, rallying the troops even before he is prime minister, they tend to go to him first in Nazi
Right.
propaganda. So I think there is, and of course there is a difference in how they are willing to wage war. Chamberlain, of course, was very nervous about the kind of German territory that could be bombed by Bomber Command. Part of that is Franklin D. Roosevelt's appeal to both countries at the beginning of the war to say, please avoid civilians, and all of these different aspects. But I think part of it as well is I don't
So,
think he can ever fully quite accept what has broken out. I think because he tried so hard to prevent it, that he's very uncomfortable even at the prospect of bombing the Ruhr, which is an key industrial area of
yes.
Germany,
Yeah.
and is referred to by the Germans as the Waffenschmiede des Reiches, or the armory of the Reich. So if there's ever, like a legitimate
Beautifully
military
pronounced.
target. Yeah. Oh, thank you. um, if there's ever a proper military target that you could go for, that is it. And even Chamberlain is uncomfortable about that. So with Churchill, there is a recognition that there could be an escalation in the air war, considering that he's got this very sort of fiery rhetoric, and doesn't take threats lying down.
So all leaders are clearly very well aware of how this war could unfold and that
Hmm.
civilian casualties look inevitable. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
They're very well
Yes.
aware of it.
They are. I mean, they've created the blueprint for it, with Guernica, and also with so many other cities and towns and villages in Spain. I think people don't realize just how much the Germans had experimented with that, to the point that obviously they had many of their Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers deployed there. And they'd even started to bomb villages in a way that they would then go and take photographs of the damage created, and also try and trace the bomb patterns to see how accurate they had been. So
Wow.
they knew that they were stoking this. When we look at the Italo-Abyssinian War as well, and there's the use of aerial gas in that and bombardment, this has really been shaping the 1930s. So both countries know that this is where it's going to end. And Churchill was also very much aware of this with his experiences in the First World War, and sort of looking
Yes.
into the Royal Naval Air Service and trying to bomb the Germans in turn. So it's one of those elements that all sides are fully aware that this is where it could go, but it's a case of when.
Oh, the sense of dread to be in that position. Oh,
Oof.
How awful.
Mm.
You set the scene beautifully, by the way. Thank you. So,
Oh, thank you.
okay, right. So we know what's coming. We know what's coming. So Hitler's now dealing with Churchill, so to speak, and
Mm.
the offer of peace. There is no acceptance of any offer of peace. So now we are facing the Battle of Britain. So
Mm.
let's have a look. So I mean, there's been a lot of, especially when it's the victors, right? You know, eventual
Yeah.
victors. There's a huge romanticism about, you know, the Spitfire. But if we look at this honestly and we try and take a neutral assessment,
Yeah.
how does one air force compare against the other? What's the feeling on both
Yeah.
sides, or particularly the Luftwaffe, I should say? How do they
Yeah.
feel they stack up against the likes of the Spitfire with a Messerschmitt?
Yes, excellent question. So I think perhaps it makes sense for us to go on military strength first and then go on to
Yeah,
how the aircraft stacked up after, if that's okay.
sure.
Um, so there's no denying as we go into the Second World War that the Luftwaffe is a considerably bigger organization than the Royal Air Force. It, of course, has had the chance to rearm, firstly, quietly in the shadows post Versailles. So
Yes.
the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War had removed all German military and naval air forces, but the Germans, even under the Weimar Republic, had been starting to create what was known as a Schwarze Luftwaffe or a shadow Luftwaffe. And this was, directly against the Treaty of
Contravention
Versailles, but
of, yeah.
absolutely, yes. So it's one of those moments where they have been slowly building that up. But of course, under the Nazis and for Hitler, of course, rearmament is key to his vision for a stronger, for a greater Germany, and for eventually taking back the territory that they saw as their own, which had been taken away in their mind post the First World War. They've had a jump head start of rearmament from 1935 to 1939, but already the groundwork was there in the early 1930s. And so it has expanded rapidly, which is both for better and worse for them. On the one hand, they've got larger numbers initially in terms of their personnel and their aircraft, but it has rearmed at quite an unnatural pace. They don't really have proper reserves, for instance, whereas the British do. And of course, in the Battle of Britain, that ends up being incredibly important. The fact that Air Vice Marshal Sir Keith Park is able to keep hold of his reserves pretty much till mid-September 1940. And of course, that's one thing that both Park and Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding are very much credited with, is that ability to conserve their aircraft exactly when they needed them. But as we go into July 1940, the Germans are feeling the effects of the campaigns they've just had. Over Norway, for instance, it wasn't as straightforward as people often try to present.
Okay.
And so they have had a
Deception and
bloodletting.
reality. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah, and, the same in the last parts, the sort of closing weeks of the fall of France. I mean, the French fought incredibly hard, and inflict even more injuries than they do at the beginning of the French campaign, but, ultimately, it's not enough. But it's one of those moments that even though the Germans are kind of licking their wounds from those, of course, they have accumulated more operational experience, which will serve them well in the Battle of Britain. And that's one of the areas where they hold a lot of it of competency and experience over the RAF. So during the Battle of Britain, for instance, the average Luftwaffe airman is about 25, and he tends to have had between sort of 4 and 6 years average service, whereas in the RAF's fighter command, each pilot is about 20 years old. So when you think, I mean, even just when you think about going from 20 to 25 yourself, and it's amazing to me to think of it that way, because I mean, in some ways being 20 is perhaps an advantage in terms of perhaps you haven't got quite so much awareness of the danger to yourself, and perhaps it gives you a sense of invincibility. But you also think, well, what about the fact that by the time you're sort of 25, 26, you're probably more likely to have had a family, particularly back then. And I sort of think, how would that have made a difference in terms of combat morale? The fact that you are fighting for your family and for the need to come home to your kids and that sort of thing, which perhaps was more the case for German airmen than it was for British airmen. And so I think that's an interesting prospect. But in terms of the aircraft, it's one of those things where they sort of, on paper, it looks terrible for the RAF at the beginning of the Battle of Britain. It's around 600 to 700 fighters. Not all of them are operational. They're often stacked against, the figure of over 2,000 German aircraft and probably about 1,100 single seat fighters. So Messerschmitt Bf 109s, and then having about sort of 300, 400 twin engine fighters in the Bf 110. So it's one of those things where, on paper, the numbers look horrific going into the Battle of Britain.
So they're the RAF are outnumbered, what, about 2-1? Is that right?
A bit under, probably. Well, it's hard to say because it's one of those things that it also depends on what's operational. So sometimes you'll see the figure of about 780 fighters for the RAF, but it's one of those things that actually, in some sources, they say it's closer to about 600 actually being operational, i.e., you can fling them up in the air the next day, sort of thing. Interestingly, you often won't see the German figures quoted the same way of what actually would have been operational. So they'll often say, it's 600 to 700 fighters of fighter command came up against 2,550 Luftwaffe aircraft. And it's one of those things that you need to look at what's actually available, but also the fact that they've got vulnerabilities in some of those aircraft. I mean, if you've got any German bombers that separate from the pack, for instance, they can't defend themselves in the same way as a Hurricane or a Spitfire could. And then when you also look at the fact that sometimes they even include the figures, I've seen them say 4,000 aircraft of the Luftwaffe, and yet over 1,000 of that is coastal aircraft, reconnaissance aircraft, all of these aircraft that are useful. Don't get us wrong, but they make it sound as if it's this entire armada of 4,000 aircraft all coming at once. It is like the film; they won't all come at once.
All at the same time, right? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So,
but they're romanticizing there, yes.
A little. I mean, it is absolutely. It cannot be denied in terms of fighters. The Luftwaffe does outnumber the RAF at the beginning of the Battle of Britain. They are closer to about 1,000. So a bit over 1,000 operational fighters that are comparable. The RAF is probably more reasonable to say about maybe 650 operational. But it's also one of those things that I think people do not consider the different phases of the Battle of Britain, which we will go into. Mm-hmm. And they don't consider the fact that the Channel Battle, which is the opening phase of the Battle of Britain, the Kanalkampf, as the Germans call it,
this is to knock out the Navy, right? This is to knock out parts of the Navy and the supply chains into and out of Britain. Yeah.
It's mainly focused on Allied shipping, so shipping on convoys. And it's one of those things where I think people they focus so much on the Battle of Britain as a lump sum of 4 months, and they seem to add these statistics in as if it represents the entire battle, and it really doesn't. I mean, when you look at the Channel Battle, for instance, it's not a slow pace. It's about 1,300 sorties flown by the Luftwaffe over 5 weeks. But once we get to the main thrust of the action in August 1940, when we get the advent of the Eagle attack, the Adlerangriff, that can be flown in a day. And yet by this point in August, the RAF have easily closed the gap. They've worked incredibly hard, and the Ministry of Aircraft Production, all of these different elements have worked so hard to level it. So as we go into August 1940, both sides are at around 1,000 fighters apiece. So they've done remarkably well.
So British production of planes started to outgun, so to speak, the Luftwaffe in terms of production of planes. So it evens things up. Very interesting. Right. Yes. Okay. So obviously they come up against each other over France and Northern Europe. What was the Luftwaffe's feelings of the pilots,
Mm.
of the command,
Mhm.
as they entered the Battle of Britain?
Mm. Well, it's very individual. I think every Luftwaffe pilot has his own perception. Of course, that is very much shaped by their own experiences of certain aircraft. Um, in terms of how they feel they balance out or level up with them, it's one of those moments where they are like the British in terms of the fact that there is this awe of the Spitfire. And
Really?
it's,
Why?
yes,
Why? Even
it,
even at that phase?
even at that phase. So it's referred to as a phenomenon of Spitfire snobbery, and the idea of this is that it made for incredibly convenient ways of explaining why they've been shot down. So the Luftwaffe prisoners of war that were captured often would completely swear blind that they had been shot down by a Spitfire because it was seen as, an aircraft that at least rivaled the Bf 109, if actually bested it in certain cases. And there were some Luftwaffe pilots that believed the Spitfire was better. I think the majority tended to trust in their Bf 109s. And I know that
German engineering, yes. Famed.
yes, exactly. Yes. And they know what they're getting with the Bf 109. They had started testing it out in the Spanish Civil War. It's not let them down in so many different campaigns. And so as a result, I think they sort of have that faith in it. But the thing is the Spitfire is easily its rival, its main rival.
Almost its
And
match. Right, yeah.
almost its match, and as a result, it doesn't seem quite so embarrassing to be shot down by this, feat of engineering, and this happens also in Nazi propaganda as well. They have moments where they celebrate when a Spitfire is shot down because they say, "Oh, well, that's the very best that the British could throw at us, and we've still shot it down."
Another Goebbels
Um
special, right? Okay.
Oh, of course, oh, plenty of those. Yeah, absolute. My God, the goalposts they moved during the Battle of Britain. But we can go on to that later.
We'll get to that, yes.
We'll get to
Because
that later.
I mean, I was reading. I don't know if this was shared with the pilots, but I mean, the high command, they were thinking that they could knock out the RAF in about 4 to 6 weeks, right?
Yes. So Goering assures Hitler that they can be knocked out within so many weeks, and it's one of those moments that really, I think, because his ego is very much inflated by July 1940, he's been elevated to the Reichsmarschall and, feels he is this all conquering force. He is a little bit presumptive about how the
Yes.
campaign over Britain is going to go. And so it's one of those moments where he just sort of, I think what doesn't help is he is being fed the wrong information on aircraft. There is
Wrong
this sort of,
intelligence. Yes.
yes, exactly, under Major Beppo Schmidt particularly, who sort of often created reports to sort of massage Goering's ego, and he's not getting quite a clear image of what's truly happening. But it's also one of those things where they just it is ego on Goering's side of things. I think also, to be fair, the Channel battle did go relatively well for the Germans. They had sunk so many tons of shipping, and at points they'd interrupted the Channel Sea traffic, and at some points the ships had to be limited in how many passed through Dover in daylight, and all of these elements. So they had put pressure on the British. But I do think there was a certain kind of hubris from Goering that had kind of steered his expectations for the Battle of Britain. Um, and I think, to be fair, the kind of belief that really, as we sort of see in the Battle of Britain film, which is based on the interaction in Adolf Gallant's autobiography, The First and the Last, this idea of what more could you want? You've got a BF 109, you've got this excellent fighter that has not let you down. What more tools do you need to secure this campaign? And so it's an interesting aspect, but I think they underestimate, for instance, the Hurricane tremendously, I think,
Mhm.
which doesn't help. And I think they
Who
have this.
specifically underestimates that? Is it Schmidt again?
It's gallant, it's Steinhoff, so Johannes Steinhoff. They said about how we were lucky to meet hurricanes. They felt that its climb and its maneuverability and everything was against it. And yes, it was slower than the Bf 109. But of course it had a very stable gun platform. It could outturn the Bf 109. Although some Luftwaffe veterans, they claimed that they thought the Bf-109 probably could outturn the Spitfire and the Hurricane, but apparently when it turned, the leading edge slats would bang. And so if they went a little too, had a bit too much kind of
Too much
momentum,
steer. Yeah.
yeah, it would spook them because they think they'd be understandably, you'd think you'd be shot at.
Right.
So they wondered if perhaps they didn't use it to their advantage because they basically were terrified that actually they'd been caught out. Um, but that's the thing with the Hurricane. The issue is that they underestimate it and they think it doesn't match up to them, but they get a lot of Spitfire and Hurricane kills mixed up. And of course, the Hurricane is deployed in greater numbers during
Yeah.
the Battle of Britain and secures between 60 and 75% of the kills. So it's one of those things where they don't quite respect what they're coming up against. And I absolutely love that story of there's one German airman that comes down and he's shot down by Peter Townsend, who of course is a famous
Yes.
Hurricane pilot.
Yes.
And I love that he had an argument with Townsend over him not being a Spitfire pilot and him saying to Townsend,
No, I am.
if anyone asks, please tell them I was shot down by a Spitfire. It's a fascinating subject. But yeah, I mean, it varied. The sort of the BF 110 pilots, they didn't tend to take the Hurricane so lightly. I mean, the BF 110 was impressively armed. It really packed a punch more so than the BF 109, but at the same time wasn't quite as maneuverable. It's heavier, it's twin engined. If it's caught on the defensive, it's not really going to be able to outmaneuver against a Spitfire and a Hurricane. So they learn to be a bit more careful with it. But I think there is a certain degree of arrogance amongst the BF 109 pilots that doesn't serve them well coming up against the Hurricane.
Right. Interesting. Interesting. Now, sort of read in my research on this that German pilots felt like they had no rest. So they'd be up
Yeah.
flying for a long, long time, come back, have to write
Yeah.
reports. They might get to a bar or something in the evening, but then it's not home. It's in France.
No.
French barman's probably looking at them oddly, going,
Yeah.
not
Yeah,
keen on
I
you.
would think so.
It's not a
Yeah.
friendly, homely sort of experience. So they're constantly under
No.
stress. The stress is huge, right?
They are. They're very, very homesick. Obviously, the British are to some degree. They're away from their families and, from the normality of civilian life. Obviously, some thrive a bit more in that military discipline. But the thing is with the Germans is that they have that initial kind of joy, jubilation, sense of achievement when they come into France and the weather's lovely in terms of it's a nice time in the summer and they're getting to enjoy local cuisine and all of these elements. But they are also acutely aware that it is not their country. And one of the airmen, for instance, noticed he was in the house of a French doctor, and he opened one of the books, and it was a children's book, and it showed Germans cutting the heads off of people. And he was shocked because he didn't expect to see that kind of demonization of the Germans. Of course, the French were going to feel much differently with their country being having been overrun
Of
and
course. Yeah.
so frequently in the past 20 years. And so it's one of those moments where they do feel that homesickness. And in Eagle Days, there's a letter from a Luftwaffe doctor who's attached to a bomber wing. And on Eagle Day itself, so the 13th of August 1940, when we get the Eagle attack, the sort of main attacks against RAF airfields, infrastructure, the British aircraft industry, all of those important parts of defence infrastructure, he sounds broken. He writes a letter to his wife and he says that, how much he's missing her and the fact that he feels like he's changing on the front line and the fact that he feels like they're hardened men, steel men, as he refers to, and he
Or in terms of the opposition. Yeah. The RAF.
yeah, what they No, as in how they feel themselves, sorry, as
Oh,
in
right. Sorry.
they feel like they're no, sorry, I wasn't clear enough. Yeah, they feel as if their hearts their hearts are kind of hardening because of this war, and he says that, "I really don't think our nerves are gonna hold out." And that's only into mid-August 1940, so he's already been exhausted, treating all of these different men. He talks about how his entire bomber wing is also really depleted despite all of these successes. And, the fact that they are exhausted from the combat operations, but also missing their family, really sort of plays on their mind. And then, of course, as we get towards the end of August 1940, and the stray German bombs drop on some of the residential areas in London, and Churchill green lights his retaliatory blow against Berlin.
Yes.
Sometimes the Luftwaffe personnel, whether they are in the flying arms or air signalmen or part of the anti-aircraft units, their letters start getting consumed by their worries of their families back home in Berlin and some of the German cities that are starting to get hit a little bit more increasingly by bomber command. So they've got those stresses as well. It's not just the homesickness of they're away from their culture and what they know, but they're also worried about, if any of their family are going to succumb under British bombs.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so that's another additional stress. And I think where they get the worst in terms of going back to the question on rest, um, the Germans do have the issue of, because they lack a rest rotation system, which the doctor actually complains about, the junior doctor. He gets very frustrated, not just at the fact that the men get no rest, but also he feels that there's some men at the home front in Germany that are sort of shirking their duties. It's like he sees the brave men who are on the front line all the time, and he sort of gets frustrated at the fact that they are never given relief from those back home. So there's not only that, but there's also a bit of a schism that appears between, the Geschwaderkommodore, or the wing commodores that try to protect their men. So Karl Fieck, for instance, he tried to send his men on a swim, or tried to get them to go on a walk, or he did his best considering he couldn't just send them home on leave. And yet the Luftwaffe High Command were very much like, you've gone soft. Why are you treating them softly? So that was interesting in terms of the fact that they don't have that rest rotation. But it's important to look at it both ways, because one of the other benefits of not having that rotation is that you can rack up so many more kills, you know.
That was going to be one of my questions. Why did they have
Yeah,
more kills? Yeah, it
yeah,
ended the way it did.
yes, yeah. So, yeah, funny we should mention that. Yes. The thing is because they are able to be on the front line so often, yes,
More
they're getting
flying hours.
tired.
Yeah.
It's a lot of flying hours. So statistically, you are increasing your chances of getting a kill. You are in contact with the enemy more consistently. The British, it's good that they have a rest rotation system. And we've also got to bear in mind that sometimes that wasn't optimal. I mean, Dowding tried to give his men at least one day off a week. When it's really intense, they can't do that. They can't afford it. And they do have to be, sleeping in and around their aircraft, because they haven't really got time to go back to the accommodation at really intense parts of the Battle of Britain. But the issue with having to be rotated is, yes, you're a bit more rested, but also you can't necessarily rack up all the impressive victories that the Germans are
Stats.
claiming.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think an interesting point, though, is even though the Luftwaffe is often seen as this fly until you die organization, it's seen as oh, well, you just keep going out there. We're not going to rotate you. You need to keep being useful to the fatherland. And when you're not, we'll take you away. The Luftwaffe's psychological services, or rather its kind of medical corps, were actually very understanding of Luftwaffe personnel that couldn't fly anymore. So even if you had one airman that was struggling in a Luftwaffe bomber crew, they would take the entire crew out, because they believe that you can't have the same cohesion if one
One's missing.
person
Yeah.
is struggling. And it is quite stark contrast to the concept of lack of moral fiber in bomber command, for instance. There's quite a lot of understanding in the Luftwaffe about war neurosis, and this is to the point that when Luftwaffe personnel were really struggling psychologically, they would be withdrawn from service and they would be sent to what was known as an Erholungsheim or a convalescence home. And these were designed to be really, the opposite of being clinical. They were in the country, they had lots of nice activities to do. I suppose it's a bit sort of like occupational therapy, but in a way that wasn't quite so clinical. And about I think it's about between only 30% of men that were sent there ever went back to frontline flying. So they weren't forced back in. It was one of those elements where they sort of, if they knew that they couldn't fly and they didn't have the nerves to fly anymore, they would be put either into a munitions factory or into a ground crew role with the Luftwaffe. So they were still useful to the front line, but they didn't push them
Not the same
beyond
intensity.
where they,
Yeah.
where they felt they should be. And they sort of, I think the thing is with the Luftwaffe, because they had so many more psychologists compared to the RAF, and they'd had them since the sort of early to mid 1930s, they were a bit more understanding in that regard. And they'd already had about 30 to 40 psychologists, I think, sort of around the early years of the Second World War. And the RAF don't catch up in this figure until about 1943. So they have quite a big edge, not just only in their recruitment and the training of Luftwaffe recruits, but also weaning out those that aren't psychologically suited to it. And so even though there is the lack of rotation, I think they already were so careful to get the right candidates to start with and to weed out those that wouldn't
So
be
they
suited to
profiled
the
them.
stresses. They profiled them very carefully.
Pilots. Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, they come up against a lot of surprises or things that make the invasion that bit harder, all sorts of
Yeah.
aspects. And you see, was it a regular change of tactics based on a failure of intelligence that ultimately does for the Luftwaffe in the invasion of Britain? Is it, and I guess I'm ultimately coming down to another question with this, is going, was this ultimately an RAF and British win, or was it a Luftwaffe failure, albeit a failure of
Oh,
intelligence?
I think it's kind of, we're looking at that sort of aspect of whether it's a victory or defeat and what actually causes it. Yes, it is a lack of focus on the German part when it comes to its changing of tactics. We see that most clearly with Goering's impulsivity and impatience, particularly where radar is concerned. And the fact that he doesn't quite strike so much at the radar stations, at the transmitter and receiver towers along the coastline. They do not get pummeled to the level that they should. And they kind of have faulty intelligence there in terms of they often see the different airfields and stations being knocked out, and they're not. They in many cases they are patched up within a day, if not a few days. And that definitely skews the picture for the Luftwaffe. They do lose a sense of where they are in the battle. So it doesn't help when you've got very prominent figures saying things that are wrong, like Albert Kesselring, for instance. He believes that it's pretty much wiped out. Hugo Sperler, on the other hand, has a more realistic and a pragmatic appraisal of how much of fighter command is left as we sort of go into the early autumn of 1940.
So Nazi command is a bit divided.
It's divided, yes. I mean, and they're divided on sea line as well. There is so much back and forth, and it causes a lot of instability for the Luftwaffe, because even if they manage to secure air superiority and preferably air supremacy in the Battle of Britain, they can't fully guarantee that the Army and the Navy are going to be ready to
It's only part of the job done, right? It's only part of the job done. Yeah.
It's one tick box done. And so that's concerning for them. I think one thing I've always thought about as a hypothetical, and I know sometimes people don't like historical hypotheticals, they say it was what it was. And I agree, you can't chase these things around all the time. But I always sort of think to myself, if they had moved a bit more into, there seems to be that sort of split focus between the Battle of the Atlantic but also doing the Channel Battle, and it's one of those things that it's kind of, they just couldn't quite decide. I think they see the Battle of the Atlantic and they think, okay, well, yes, we can do a sort of blockade ourselves kind of thing. And then it's like, but actually you've taken your foot off the throat of the Allied shipping and convoys. So then you're moving over to the RAF airfields and radar installations, and then you take your foot off there. And that's the problem, is they keep jumping from thing to thing. And
Are they
it's
over
not
experimenting? They're over experimenting as to what might
I
work,
I think so. I think so. I think they sort of they don't know what's going to work.
what might
And
stick.
fair Yeah, and to be fair to them, this is completely unprecedented to have an all, pretty much exclusive aerial campaign for. This is uncharted territory. So you can understand why they cast the net wide, but I think that's the problem. They can't ever fully consolidate something, whether it's radar, whether it's shipping, and of course, with the Blitz, they change that sort of momentum, and fighter command are able to get a breather, and to not entirely rejuvenate themselves, but to get enough of time to sort of regather their strength and launch, a stinging counterattack on Battle of Britain Day on the
Yeah.
15th of September 1940. But it just, yeah, it's too ambitious. It's just too much, and I think
Too much, too
this
far. Yeah.
too much, too far. The range is not ideal. I mean, some Luftwaffe personnel felt that they were in quite a favourable position because they sort of had this crescent almost partially surrounding Britain on
Yes.
the coastline, and the fact that it had run all the way from France all the way up to Scandinavia. But it's one of those, they can't fully consolidate anything because they keep changing their minds, and ultimately that is what loses them the Battle of Britain. So
What was that?
it's
Sorry
a
to
it's a
interrupt. Was that down
right.
to Goering's impatience
Mm.
or Schmidt telling him what he wanted to hear, or a combination of both?
It's a combination. I think there is a sort of sense that they have laid the way for Sea Lion more favorably than they actually have. I think also, to be fair, the reflection of the lower contact rate between the RAF and the Luftwaffe sort of heading towards the end of August 1940 confirms to the Germans that actually surely their numbers must be dropping. And Bob mentions this, for instance, the fact that sometimes they could fly not far from London and not be challenged at certain points towards the end of August 1940. And I think for them, it was an unlucky mixture of not quite getting the right statistics, but also their kind of anecdotal experience adding to that. And that sense
Okay.
of security and thinking, oh, surely we seem to have wiped them out. So I think that's ultimately what kind of drives them. I mean, I do make the argument in Eagle Days that it wasn't entirely irrational for Goering to attack London, because that was the end goal of the Eagle attack. They wanted to attack in concentric circles leading up to London, because whether they force a political decision or whether they do launch Operation Sea Lion, you have to subdue the capital. So it's not entirely irrational to do that. And we've got to bear in mind that Goering was under increasing pressure on the home front. We start to get the bomber command raids against Berlin. He had previously said, no bombers are going to reach the Reich. It gets
And that,
proven
yeah,
wrong.
yeah, he
Yeah.
does.
And there's a fascinating account of a Luftwaffe widow who ends up shouting at Goering when he's on one of the tours of Berlin, and I won't use the swear words on the Aces Hype podcast,
Okay.
but she does call him a dumb cop,
Right.
sort of
Okay.
fathead, an idiot, and a bit more before that, with beginning with an F, and she ends up getting dragged away by the Gestapo, because you just don't shout that at the
Yeah. There's none of
Reichsmarschall.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that he gets increasingly nervous when he's touring some of the bomb damage in Berlin, because he's getting all these, you know, from her description, these wives and these children and these mothers that are coming up to him and kind of babbling slightly and are hysterical and aren't expecting this. The fact that there's bomb damage in Germany by the British, even though it's relatively minor, and so I think we shouldn't forget that they do have that pressure. And so much so that Hitler does refer to it in his speech from the 4th of September 1940. And he talks about the fact that British are starting to bomb civilians in his mind. Obviously he's putting it as being German civilians. So I I feel like it's one of those things where it's not entirely unreasonable to think that way, to see the logic of doing that. But the thing is he did it too soon. He did not take the time to fully confirm the state of the British. He
to see if it would stick.
underestimated, yeah, the aspects of radar, which was, very much completely skipped over at certain points in some of Schmidt's reports in early July 1940. And as a result, it comes too soon. They are too presumptive about Britain's true condition, and ultimately they are just not ready for that kind of, when we start to get all of the British resurgence in mid-September. They're just not prepared for it.
So obviously this all comes to a crescendo, Battle of Britain
Yeah.
Day.
Yes.
And the Luftwaffe, they swarm over, as I understand it.
Yeah.
And I think is it correct that they lost 56 aircraft on that day? Is that
Yes.
correct? To
Yeah.
28 RAF planes. So that 2-to-1 ratio is almost spurious earlier, to be fair, given what you were saying, but it's a
Yeah.
2-to-1 reversal in terms of downing
Yeah.
planes on that day. That is
Yeah.
accurate, is it?
Yes, yeah, it's two for, yeah, but about two German aircraft for every British fighter lost. And that is quite a reversal. And they had closed on more favourable ratios towards the end of August 1940. So they, on their best days, they'd gone closer to 1-to-1. So they'd levelled out the immediate losses that had come on really bad days, like Schwarzer Donnerstag, or Black Thursday, on the 15th of
Black
August,
Thursday,
which
yes.
was Black Thursday, the hardest day, of course, on the 18th of August, the highest collective losses for both sides. And they'd got closer to 1-to-1, but in certain cases, the German fighter pilots, specifically, when we take out the bomber losses, in some cases had been superior to the British towards the end of August 1940 and shooting more down. So it had started to improve for them. But yes, by the time we get to the Battle of Britain Day, the fighter command close in on an average of shooting down 2 German aircraft for every British aircraft lost. And they're just that they cannot be sustained at that speed. And we see that in the fact that Hitler postponed Sea Lion 2 days later, indefinitely, on the 17th of September.
So is this the first major turning point? I know there are a few major turning points. Is this the first one? Is this the first bit of hope
Yeah.
for all concerned on the Allied side?
Yes, I think so. I'd go so far to argue that. I mean, some historians have said that they think it's a bit of an Anglo-centric interpretation to put the Battle of Britain as a turning point. I think it's, as I say, I tend to refer to it as pivotal or crucial, because it's sort of it has made the German victory not necessarily completely impossible, but it has made it so much more drawn out. It has made the strategic situation look so much more muddied and unclear, and it is a blow because they are used to subduing nations quickly.
Yeah, it's
And
not lightning anymore. Yeah,
it's not lightning anymore. That's
it
the
all
thing,
stops. Yeah.
they've managed a bit of static, and that's it, and and so that, I think that's so important, and we see that in the fact that Werner Baumbach, for instance, who is a Luftwaffe bomber pilot during the Battle of Britain, he writes about how he gets so fed up of the German public going, "When's our victory? When's our victory?" and this kind of frustration of how long it's taking them to win, because the Germans are used to it. The public, from a military perspective, have been spoiled victory after victory within a few months, if not weeks.
It is a hot knife through butter.
Yeah, exactly. So it's so startling to them, and it's the morale of the Germans, particularly in the Blitz, the fact they lose 600 more bombers off the back of the Battle of Britain. And they see this as an entire campaign, the Luftschlacht um England, the air battle for England, that is 10 months, So we see it as a 4-month campaign in the Battle of Britain, but to the Germans, it's 10 months of wasted energy. And that, as you're going into the spring of 1941, that's a crushing blow for them.
Well, that's a great point to start to bring to a close our chat. And obviously, you've got your book coming out very shortly. You have the launch event at Aces High, which is on the 1st of June. So be sure to check out Aces High website. Get yourself booked in for that. You'll be talking we'll be doing a Q&A with Air Marshal Black Robertson.
Yes.
And he's an
Yeah.
absolute gent, lovely man, and I'm sure
Yeah.
that'll be a fantastic chat. We look forward to it, and we are
Thank
very
you.
pleased that you chose us to launch your book there. So thank you.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I just thank you so much for the opportunity, because I was so intrigued by the fact that we could depict it not just in the talks that we have, but the fact you've got the artwork, and that you can curate it in such a way that you can bring the battle to life.
And a nice
And I thought that
replica
was just such a
Spitfire
unique.
too. Yeah.
Doesn't hurt. No, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much. The honor's all mine.
Fantastic. No, the
To
honour's ours,
have
but
this event
thank
with
you.
you.
And in terms of where can people find you online and all those kind of things, your @ handle, which is brilliant, by the way, but go on, please share
Oh,
away.
thank you. Yes, so the @ handle for X, formerly known as Twitter, is Spitfire Philly, and my website is www.spitfirephillyaviation.com, and that's sort of a resource of things I've done, things that documentaries I've been working on, and articles, and bits and bobs that I've done, really. But the most important and the most exciting thing this year is all of the Eagle Days events, of which Aces High really is the first major big one. So it's going to be really exciting, really good night.
Fantastic. Well, Victoria, thank you so much, and much appreciated. So we look forward to seeing you on the 1st of June.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really enjoyed this chat.
Okay, so thank you to everyone who made it this far. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. You can meet Victoria for yourself on Sunday, the 1st of June, where she'll be live in conversation with the esteemed Air Marshal Black Robertson, with a Q&A opening up to the audience. We'll have the book signing, plenty of refreshments to go around, and of course, this will all be alongside a specially curated exhibition of Battle of Britain artwork. Learn more about the events and where to order your signed copies of Eagle Days in the description. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.